Hello and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I feel so privileged you are taking time out of your busy life to learn all about the ways to interpret neurodivergence for you and your child. Remember, all advice on this podcast is general and may not specifically apply to your child, so we encourage you to also talk to your GP, paediatrician or specialist to see if what you've learned will help your family. Hello, and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I'm Carly. Today, our topic is what is FASD, or Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. This might be a new topic for some of our listeners. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder hasn't been discussed or understood quite broadly, and it's definitely increasing in terms of knowledge and awareness over the last couple of years. We've got a long way to go before we really get the prevalence of understanding that we have across other neurodivergences. So today we're really, really lucky to have Prue Walker with us. She is incredibly knowledgeable on this topic, and it is one of the things that she has spent a very long time learning about. She spent 15 years working on FASD. Prue Walker is a clinical social worker specialising in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. She holds a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Melbourne and a Master of Arts in Social Policy from RMIT. Prue has 20 years' experience in child protection and out-of-home care services, having worked as a manager and practice leader in both Victoria and the Northern Territory, and has also managed adoption and permanent care services. In 2008, Prue was awarded a Churchill Fellowship, allowing her to study models of care for children with FASD in the US and Canada. She's worked as a senior social worker with the Victorian Fetal Alcohol Service, also known as VicFAS, a diagnostic clinic at Monash Children's Hospital, since its establishment in 2019. She has recently commenced a new role as clinical coordinator for FASD Connect, a statewide service supporting diagnosis of children in out-of-home care. Prue provides training and consultation services to families, professionals and organisations to better address the needs of those with FASD. She is an advocate for improved identification of FASD within the child protection system in order to reduce risks to children and young people. She has also received a number of awards, including the Monash Health 2023 Award for Excellence in Allied Health Practice and the winner of the 2024 Hester Award for Individual Leadership in Allied Health. We are incredibly lucky to have her today. Hello, Prue, and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way. So thrilled to have you here today.
Hey, Carly, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So really looking forward to bringing this topic to everybody today, talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It's amazing how prevalent it is and how little people know about it. So I'm definitely looking forward to kind of filling the gap there as much as we can. I'd love you to start off with just a bit of a high-level definition of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is basically a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's when someone has been exposed to alcohol during pregnancy and it's caused difficulties that really severely impair the person in daily life. So there's a range of ways alcohol can affect people in pregnancy, but FASD, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is when the effects are severe enough that they have that real impairment.
Okay, great. And it might be really helpful here to maybe indicate some of the key things that people might notice in terms of those impairments.
So FASD can cause a range of learning impairments, developmental delays, particularly behavioural problems that relate to self-regulation. So while some people can have learning problems like, they might have intellectual impairment, although often not, they might have difficulties in particular areas of thinking and memory and learning. But they often also have difficulties in just regulating their attention, their behaviour, their emotions. And so this can lead to difficulties in a whole range of areas of daily life.
So with the podcast, we're talking about neurodivergence, and I think for quite a while neurodivergence wasn't including FASD. The conversation or the rationale there was often because it was something that didn't happen through the organic genetic creation of the brain and the brain's pathways, but was done through impact in utero. However, the conversation's definitely evolving in that it is something that still impacts the brain and how the brain then is able to interact with its environment. Prue, are you able to explain some of the areas of the brain that are impacted?
So the thing with alcohol in pregnancy is it affects so many areas of the brain, and we know the brain is a really complex system. So we're learning more about the number of or the variety of ways that the brain can be affected. So we talk about things like the stress regulation center of the brain, the hypothalamus and the amygdala. Those parts of the brain, those structures can be particularly affected through alcohol exposure. So that can lead to a sort of predisposition to that fight or flight reaction, to overreacting to things, and not being able to calm the nervous system. It can also affect, the prefrontal cortex, so that higher order thinking. But we know it also affects, the endocrine system and the neurochemical transmitters. So people can be more prone to mental health conditions, partly from that real biological basis. And then you've
Fascinating.
got areas like, the cerebellum, which has got, a role in balance and movement and coordination. So we also see those issues like fine motor skills. So it has a huge variety of impacts on daily life.
It's interesting listening to you talk there. We've talked offline about how my Mr. Six, who's my son but came into my care, has FASD, and so many of those things are covered off in what I see in terms of how he finds it much more complicated to engage with what we classify as a neurotypical environment, and it's. I suppose the really interesting thing about FASD is that often with a lot of other neurodivergences, you see them largely sitting in one particular space within the brain, but this is, it covers so many different areas, so it has so many different ways of showing up. So FASD isn't as well known in terms of sort of neurodisorders, but it's obviously been around for a very long time. Would you be able to explain its prevalence or the data we have for its prevalence at the moment?
Yeah. Look, the estimates we have from international research are that FASD affects around 1 in 100 people globally. And so in Australia, we think that, some estimates are higher at, 2 to 4 or 2 to 5% of the population. It's a difficult one because we're partly talking about the cutoff for the diagnosis of this as a disorder. So, in countries where you might have a slightly wider criteria, you're going to have a higher prevalence because it's statistics.
Yeah.
But I would confidently say 1 to 2% of the population of Australia is likely to be affected, and I think the majority of those individuals wouldn't be aware of it.
I was about to say, so would you believe that FASD is probably one of the more underreported neurodivergences?
Absolutely, absolutely. Probably, I can't think of anything that's less reported. If you look at, it has a similar prevalence to autism, I think. I'm reading estimates of autism now at up to 4% of the population. But if you look at just who's on the NDIS, I think there's about 3,000 people on the NDIS with FASD and well over 200,000 with autism.
Wow, that's a massive statistic when we're looking at something that actually appears, basically as often. So in my mind, I guess I'm thinking here, the underreporting, I'm guessing we've got two different things going on here. We've got the lack of knowledge, and as we've already indicated, this is it's a really new thing for a lot of people to be understanding, unlike autism, which is, it's definitely still, there's a huge education piece around it. There's a huge advocacy piece around it. But when you say autism, people still connect with what it is and what it stands for. Whereas saying FASD or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a lot more of, what's that? But I guess the other big challenge here is the stigma that comes along with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Yes, and look, I think there's a lot of angles to the stigma. Because it is linked to a alcohol exposure, which is a common toxin. And the way that I talk about it is that it's a toxin that's present in a lot of Australian society. Most Australians drink. Many people drink before they know they're pregnant. And so, we need to really think about how we, really place personal responsibility on this and how much we treat it as a societal issue that could happen to so many people. I think in my generation, our parents weren't aware of the harms of alcohol in pregnancy. So I think many people in my generation probably have had alcohol in pregnancy. And so there's a responsibility, I think, on our community to be educating people generally about this and not just focusing on, an individual choice, but, the frequency at which people share alcohol in our social events, I think another aspect of the stigma has come from the fact that, it's been compared to other neurodivergences, it was linked in the early studies to sort of facial abnormalities, and so a sense that there had to be some physical effects, which I think also contributes to the stigma, that it's something you can see, and that clearly it's on the most part quite a hidden disorder, but it's been associated with this sort of severity of physical effects that I think makes it different to something like autism, where it's more about seeing the world differently or having a different way of processing sensory input. People with FASD have those difficulties, but that's not what's been, I guess, focused on historically in the literature. And I think, one of the other differences, I think, is that there are some fabulous adults with FASD who are great advocates in our community. I think that's been a more recent development. We haven't had so many people, as are perhaps in the autism community, talking about, their different way of seeing the world.
Most definitely. I saw a beautiful photo I think it was last week. Last week was Red Shoe Week, I think.
Yes.
And up in Canberra, they've done an incredible job of creating visual prevalence around that Red Shoe campaign and asking about red shoes. They've got, great big banners all over the city, and it's not something we've really seen flow out Australia-wide, but I have to admit it really cheered me to see how much Canberra had actually sort of embraced having the conversation.
Yeah, I think they've done a fabulous job, and Jessica Birch is one of those people. She's a young adult living with FASD, and there's a beautiful quote of hers where she says, "I think it's time people saw more of our light and more of our shine," and I love that. So I actually use that when I'm doing training workshops. I put a slide up of her because it's not all, we people can live amazingly productive, great lives. But I think, one of the things Jess talks about is that not having that diagnosis early made it very difficult for her, and things really changed once she got a diagnosis. And it doesn't always help, in the sort of neurodiversity, when people are sort of saying, well, everyone's a bit whatever, or I struggle with procrastination too, that can really minimise the real impact that it actually is a disability for people, which is a challenge, because we want to focus on people's strengths, of course. But sometimes when we just look at strengths, we don't really acknowledge the barriers to their real, participation.
Completely. It's actually, it's funny. I've noticed in our conversations around, the definitions of different neurodivergences, that's a topic that frequently comes up, that people try and lead with empathy by connecting with something that they also experience. And what they don't realize is that it's actually undermining the complexity and the severity of what the person who is sharing that actually experiences on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly.
And it's hard because it is people who are genuinely trying to connect. I don't think they realise that that's what they're doing, but it truly does minimise. It's really one of those things where the best way to be compassionate and empathetic is to say, I'm really sorry, that must be really tough for you.
Yeah, exactly. And not try to, anything that occurs on a spectrum, we can all have aspects of it. We can all have aspects of being inattentive or disorganised or impulsive or whatever it might be. But we don't need a support worker in daily life to help us with, managing our household. And that's the difference, I think.
So having this conversation around diagnosis and, the prevalence of numbers and how factual they might be, I suppose it brings me around to the power of early intervention. We are aiming this conversation at parents and carers. And so,
Mm,
we're talking to parents who, some of them have quite young children, and whether they are, biological children and they have a belief that there may have been some impact based on choices that they made during pregnancy, or whether they're caring for them and they have some suspicions.
mm-hmm.
I'd be, I presume the earlier the intervention, the better. That's
Yeah.
how it tends to go. For someone who's looking out for things, what are we looking for?
Mm. I guess in small children, what we're looking for is developmental delays, first of all. Often a speech and language delay might be there, delayed motor skills, difficulties with balance, just not meeting milestones is often the first thing. And generally, what's recommended there is sort of early intervention, which might be OT, might be speech, might be physio, which is all great. Like you want that early intervention for the delay, whatever it might be, whatever's sort of indicated. I think the difference is, when we know about alcohol in pregnancy, if we do know that, then the the interventions we need really need to target those skills of self-regulation as much as the skills of pronunciation or your motor skills, because that's what causes the most difficulty at home. And I read a great study from North America about early intervention, and families were saying they don't have too much difficulty accessing things like speech therapy, but they're not getting the support for emotional regulation, and that's what's really takes the toll. So I think a big part of it, what I advocate a lot about is with families, is helping your child understand that their brain works a bit differently, and that they are going to need to get a bit more help and accept a bit more help. And that's obviously a conversation you have over maybe 8 to 10 years. It's not like a small child is going to get that. But, for a language delay, if you start looking at how you communicate differently, you might have a picture chart or something, and you can normalise that picture chart. So maybe everyone in the family has some kind of a picture chart for something, so that the child doesn't fight against the idea of getting help or getting support.
That's such a huge, huge thing. So Mr. Six,
Yes.
we've seen an epic transformation in him in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was, firstly, work with a brilliant psychologist around emotions, and we're still on a big journey. That's a very
Yeah.
early start, but it's definitely helping. But it's also it's about not feeling ashamed about getting some extra help, and it is
Mm.
a really big thing. He had a really bad issue, a bad display of a sense of self-shame every time he needed to be supported in a way that he wasn't seeing
Yeah.
his siblings being supported. And it took a lot of work, to be able to kind of come
Mm.
around that corner and to get him to understand that different brains need different types of support, and that, these are the supports that his brain needs, and
Yeah.
that there's absolutely no shame in that. And he's very lucky as well. He has an incredible prep teacher who, any of the interventions that are needed for him to regulate in the classroom, she shares them across the class. So
That's so good.
it's
Yeah.
phenomenal. So he's not singled out for anything. Everybody has the same brain breaks. Everybody gets the same opportunity for heavy work. And so he feels like he's part of everything rather than it being something that, sort of stands out. Um,
That's fantastic. I love that.
yeah.
And
We often
so
say she's
many,
pretty amazing.
so many of the things you can do can be like universal accommodations, just supporting that child. And I think the more people understand about, the specifics and the nuances of FASD, because it's a really complex thing. Like I am learning all the time, and I've talked about FASD for, I don't know, 15 years now, and I keep talking about it, and I keep learning new things, and one thing I just read recently about, I mean, this has been around for a while. We know kids with FASD can have difficulty visually tracking. The speed at which they track things is not, is there's like a lag, And so I was just thinking, well, what does that mean in the classroom when the child has to look at the board and look down at the paper, look up at the board, look down at the paper? And I said that to a family I was working with. They said, our son literally told us that. He said, I can't see it properly when you do it that way, or something like that. He articulated that his eyes were not able to do this task, and that's a simple accommodation as giving them, I mean, it can be more work for teachers to do a printout, but that child needs it to be right next to what they're doing, not up on the board,
And I think my answer when, because there's a big conversation around, the extra effort that is put on teachers these days to understand the complexities of what's in their classroom and the independent learning styles. And I completely agree.
Absolutely.
I mean, the more we're learning about brains and learning methodologies, the more that teachers are having to diversify in their classroom. But the benefit of that is that, that printout and that child sitting in that space being able to look over a smaller distance and feel in control is going to help them stay a lot more regulated, stay a lot more positive, feel a lot more proud of their achievements, and therefore their behaviour in the classroom is also going to be better.
And I think, with aids and support in the classroom as well, I mean, we have technological solutions to some of these things. You could have a little iPad set up with a camera on the board and you look at the iPad. Do you know what I mean? Like we can figure out ways that can accommodate kids' needs without it all being this massive burden on the teacher.
Yep, Mr. Six sits on a peanut ball. So, all of those times that he feels like he needs to move to calm down, he doesn't have to get up. He just bounces on his chair. And there was no argument about bringing that peanut ball into the classroom. It was just,
fantastic.
Let's give it a shot.
Yeah, great.
And I think that sometimes that's what it's about. It's about just giving it a shot and seeing how it works.
Yeah.
I found one of the really interesting learning curves for myself and for my husband as well has been impulse control and understanding impulse control in FASD. Would you mind having a little bit of a chat about how the FASD brain works with impulse control?
Yeah, so I mean, impulse control is not something we're born with, it's something we develop, and typically, if you think about a toddler, they touch something hot, they burn their fingers. Maybe they learn from that, maybe they do it 3 or 4 more times, but by a certain point, they're going to know I'm not going to touch this hot thing because I really have learnt that. It's harder for kids with FASD need a lot more repetitions for things to go into their long-term memory. They also don't learn as quickly from watching other people. Watching other people is a good way for kids to learn, but they're not necessarily going to be able to generalize, I just watched that person burn themselves on something, so I'm going to generalize that to me and go, maybe I shouldn't touch that thing. That's not a process that they're going to be able to do at a very young age. And so we can have all these, we can work on kids' skills like ability to name emotions and breathing exercises and things. But what we need to remember is in that moment, none of that is in their mind. The one thing in their mind is the thing that's just come into their mind, the new thought, which is to do whatever. And they really literally cannot access all the things you've talked about before. So they need, someone there noticing them, going, hang on, and prompting them. Remember the things that we talked about before, not necessarily remember what to do, but we talked about breathing, let's do breathing. Or we talked about, and they need someone there to pull that strategy out and remind them, but it needs to be a strategy they've done before and practiced. Can't be a new strategy, can't be a new response. So a lot of what we do is, reduce the impact or reduce the opportunity for impulsive things to be harmful, but that can be really hard. Like if you've got 7-year-olds and child safety doors, they're going to say, well, how come we still do this? So we have to have ways to do it that aren't like too restrictive, but also recognising, the risks and the risk to, family life. I mean, when 6-year-olds are emptying all the shampoo and conditioner into the bath whenever they get an opportunity to, it's a lot more frustrating than if it's a 2 or 3-year-old doing it. But really the only thing that's different is that you've expected they wouldn't do it by now.
Yeah.
And so I also talk a lot with parents and caregivers about it doesn't make it easier that you have to clean up the bath, but it does take away a little bit of that frustration about why are they still doing it. They're doing it because of their brain development. They haven't developed that ability yet. The neurons are not there yet. And so we just have to parent like they're a younger child and really regulate ourselves in that. And then there's the grief and loss associated with that, that I'm going to be parenting a child for much longer than I thought and at a much younger age than I thought. And that's, we grieve our expectations of our kids' futures. But I think this happens to everybody in different ways,
Mm-hmm.
differently so when you have a child with a permanent disability.
Mm.
So, I don't want to do that thing of saying we all do this because, but it's a familiar feeling that you think, oh,
It is.
I thought my
Yeah.
child would have this different trajectory. And
Mm-hmm.
so, grief and loss is something we have to be able to talk about. And that's hard in the neurodivergence conversation because, all brains are great, but
Mm.
FASD is a difference, but it has a cost on the kids involved and the young people. It's that they've got more barriers to overcome, and it's harder for them to, excel at things and feel really good about themselves. So that's where we need to do the work to give them those opportunities.
I think that's such a beautiful little summation. And I know as well myself, I've gone through that grieving and loss stage and the adjustment stage of, the dream you have for your child. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the adjusted view.
Mm,
It's just that it's different and you need to accept what that difference is. And that takes time.
yeah.
Um, I also think it takes time to get your brain into that space as a parent of the difference between chronological age and developmental age.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do want to look at the size of the child, the age of the child, what
Yeah.
grade they're in, and go, oh, well, I presume that they would be able to dress themselves, choose their own clothes, brush their own teeth.
Yeah.
Um, and, to then have that automatic part of you that goes, hold on, they look 8, but
Mm-hmm.
developmentally they're 5,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and bring yourself in line with that. That takes time and it takes practice. And, you can't always do it in the moment. There's definitely a lot of moments of repair where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of things are
Yes.
going on and you're like, but you're 6.
Yeah.
And you have to go back and be like, I'm sorry, mate. I didn't mean to be angry then. I was tired and I was
Yeah.
frustrated. And I know that's difficult for you. But yeah, all of these things, I think it's really important for parents to know that place takes time to get to.
Yeah.
But when you can, it gives the context to the situation. It makes it so much clearer.
Yeah. And I think it's harder in kids, kids with FASD often really need to be taught skills that other kids pick up by watching and doing and practice.
Mm,
So they need explicit teaching of these sort of skills. And one of the analogies often used in training is I ask people, what age do you start teaching a child to cross the road? And people might say, I don't know, 2, that's when you start saying, look left, look right. And then I say, what age do you expect them to do it by themselves all the time reliably? And people are like anywhere from 12 to 14.
mm,
And so really we're talking about 10 years of teaching without expecting results.
mm, mm,
And that's because we know that's how long it takes for a child to go from learning left, right, look for cars, spatial awareness, but also resisting impulses around them and remembering everything. We know that is a 10-year process. And so I think in our society, that's something that's really easy to understand. You teach, but you don't expect. But for other skills, it's not. We don't articulate it that way.
Yeah, Mr. Six really struggled with colours. Colours were
Aha.
extremely hard for him.
Yeah.
And it wasn't actually until the summer of prep that he really
Mm-hmm.
started to grasp his colours.
Yeah.
Um, and that was a really difficult one to get other people to understand because children do pick that up relatively inherently from, people
Yeah.
talking in their environment. But he really needed that specific instruction and the time for that to come together.
Yeah.
Um, and I always found that a really beautiful example of the difficulty of understanding abstract thought that
Yeah.
is often prevalent with FASD.
Yeah.
That you can't show them 7 different types of green and tell them that they're all green
No.
because it doesn't make
No.
sense that they're all green.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Where's the
and
cutoff? Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I read a great story from a caregiver, I think it was in Canada, and she'd said to teach her child colours, she dressed them in red for, for the day and said, your hat is red, your shoes are red, your socks are red. And they go off to kinder or childcare or school in red. And they do that for a week. And then they do the next colour for a week because it's so many repetitions for things to really stick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. But then there's the amazing moment when they work it out and you can see the joy on their face at being able
Yeah,
to understand what the kids around them understand. And
yeah.
it's like, it's awesome. I remember how proud he was when he said something was blue. And I was like,
Oh,
mate,
that's so great.
it's blue. And he's like, yeah, it's
Yes.
blue.
Oh, I love
Yeah,
that. And
it's
I
so
think,
cool.
it's one of the challenges with prenatal alcohol exposure that the impact on the brain is really disorganized and scattered. And sometimes what carers talk about is their child will learn something and forget it, and it'll come back a month later, and
Hmm.
then it might be
Hmm.
gone again. And
Hmm.
so things don't always happen sequentially. Learning isn't always retained in a sort of sequential manner. And so I think understanding that as well is really important, that we just have to accept that, oh, they've forgotten it today. That's okay. I'm going to teach it again,
Mm.
and not be disappointed. That's all we can control, is being disappointed if something doesn't stick. It's just how it is. They will know their colours eventually, but there'll be times when you feel like things are going backwards.
Mm. I think one of the other big key things we've learned is the importance of not necessarily teaching in the moment and understanding that in the moment might
Mm,
not be the right time,
yeah,
um, particularly around impulse control. And it's where you often see
absolutely.
what people would consider as negative behaviour,
Yeah,
um, and how important it is to just calmly talk through, let's pop that down, we probably shouldn't have that, and then to come back at a later point in time and have the
yeah,
conversation about why. And
yeah,
that's hard because it's not
yeah,
organic to do that
yeah,
when you're trying to teach a child. You want those really natural consequences to play through,
yeah, yeah.
but they're just not in a space to learn it then.
No, they're not. They're not. And I use a lot of, there's some really great YouTube videos that have been around for a while that I use a lot. And there's a guy from, I think, the States, Nathan Ori, and he talks about stealing. And there's two videos I often share with families, and I'll give you a
Mm,
link to them because he just articulates it so well about, how to help a child make sense of, ownership, and then how to respond to the behaviour afterwards for a child who doesn't really necessarily connect the consequences. Um, and
yeah,
yeah, he has some
fantastic.
really great messages about that.
Yeah, great. And I think that's it's a big struggle for people in terms of what are considered socially negative behaviours, that children
Mm-hmm.
with FASD, when they choose these actions, they're not doing them out of spite or being malicious
Mm.
or trying to be shifty, or
Yeah,
it's an action that's happening, and our natural response to that is such a shameful behavior that should
yeah,
not be happening. You want to
yeah,
come down on them really, really hard.
yeah,
Um, but it's just not the way that it's actually going to
yeah,
get the message across, and it's not their
yeah.
intention.
No,
Um, and the other really interesting thing I find is sometimes in the moment they don't even remember doing it.
very often they don't remember doing, which is why often it doesn't help to even go back over it. More than to say, um, when you got really upset, I want to be able to help you more. Let's
Mm,
practice some things that we could do for next time. And we have to be thinking about how we do the prevention. You know, they forgot their footy gear and you thought they had it, and now they can't play footy and they might have a meltdown. It's like we have to be the external person that makes sure they have the footy gear, because although it's great if they can learn to be responsible for it, they can't deal with the natural consequences of it,
mm,
can't regulate themselves when something goes wrong.
mm.
And so that's when you get escalations that can be really hard to manage, and they tend to have a flow on effect, you know. So I really talk a lot about predicting some of those things, predicting when a child's not going to be able to do whatever the expectations are in the room. And, we do this instinctively with toddlers. We don't take them shopping when they're tired.
Mm.
Kids with FASD are tired a lot. school is hard. I don't know any kids who have a great time between 4 and 6 o'clock who have FASD. It's a really tough time, you know. And I saw one beautiful thing. It was in a Facebook group of parents and carers, and they realised their little boy was coming home so dysregulated. So they had this beautiful picture. They ran him a bath. They put some dim candles in the bath. They gave him an eye patch, some headphones, and some snacks. And he was just sitting in his bath in a fairly dim room with his snacks, something to listen to. Just looked so happy. And I thought, what a
Can I have
beautiful.
that when I get home? That
I
sounds
know.
amazing.
I would like it too.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, and it's about setting them up for success. Like, that's the thing we want to do as parents, is understand where their complexities are, where they need supports, and then set them up for success so that
Yeah.
they get through that without it being something that feels excessively challenging.
Yeah.
Because the
And
world is going to be
unfortunately,
challenging enough. If we can help them, then, all the better.
it really is. It really is. And I think we need so much support for parents and caregivers who are parenting kids with FASD, because what works one day won't work another. What you put your best mind to it, you set something up, it works once, then it doesn't work again. And that can really take a toll. So we need a great care team around people to help them with that stuff, and ways to have a break and to regroup and go, we're going to keep going, with this, because sometimes it can be really hard to find the thing that makes a difference. And sometimes it's just something that we have to wait out. We can't, when your nervous system is affected by that alcohol exposure, sometimes there's nothing that's going to really soothe it, and it's just going to be patience and time and creating space and kind of minimising, the flow-on effects, prevention, even things like, when your child is woken up in a really terrible mood, it's okay to not go to school, because if they go to school, there's going to be something to deal with, and it's better to avoid some of those sort of failures, but that takes a toll on, that's expecting parents and caregivers to always be able to take that day off or whatever it might be. So that's why we need, so much support, particularly in those years.
Yeah, definitely. We also have something we do here, and it's something I will gladly share, is that we said, physical things can get damaged. They have big feelings, they have big physicality. We talked about poor impulse control, and so things happen, and getting yourself into a place where anything that's really precious, really important, and might get damaged just isn't available, because that just makes things a whole lot easier. And, my husband and I said to each other when we got a couch and realised it was probably the wrong couch for our family, we went, you know what, this is our 5-year couch.
Yeah, that's a great way to see it.
And if it gets texture on it or whatever, that's okay. It's our 5-year couch. It's only a couch. And we're going to know that we'll set with ourselves that we're going to replace that couch in 5 years, and we can just let it go.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important for you within yourself to work out the things that are really, really important, that are going to be really sensitive to you, and remove them from the space. And then the other stuff is like, pick your battles. You just have to work out how to pick your battles.
Absolutely. Someone was telling me a story about their child taking their jewellery to school to give away to other people, and that's such a typical thing to do. There's nothing you can do other than put that jewellery away. Like, it's got to be inaccessible. And that goes for siblings as well, because the idea of ownership is, a very complex thing. So we need to make sure other kids in the family, are able to keep their important things safe as well. And if a child with FASD's got special things, I always say, like, make a copy of it. Like, if they've got a photo or something precious, make a copy and laminate it and put the original away, because they can rip it up, tear it up, whatever, and they don't get the consequences that it's gone.
No.
So we've got to look after their stuff too.
So kind of jumping back a little bit, I suppose, and bringing some conversations together. With intervention and supports being so incredibly important, and with it being something that does carry a natural stigma, if we've got teachers, GPs, anyone else listening who's not a parent or a carer, How do you think we can help the parents of children who have got fetal alcohol spectrum disorder feel more comfortable to come forward and have discussions about how their child might need some more support?
I guess you've got two groups. You've got the people whose kids have a diagnosis and those where it's sort of suspected. Where it's suspected, I think, um, you know, anything we can do to support people to get the right interventions as early as possible. And if that involves a discussion about alcohol in pregnancy, what we really need is for the clinicians doing those assessments to be skilled in that discussion. It's not something necessarily a teacher or a child educator is going to be asking about the alcohol. But what we want is that when a child does have a developmental screen, that it's really thorough and that alcohol is explored, in a way that is open and non-judgmental, and it needs to, if possible, happen in a relationship where there's some trust there, or at least by a provider that's sort of skilled in asking these questions. And I think when it's known that a child has FASD, just accepting that child is will need extra support, and sometimes that support needs to be supervision, that we can set kids up to fail if we put them in situations that they can't manage. So, if you put kids out there and go, okay, take turns on the trampoline, that's not going to end well. You need someone there with a timer to give that child enough support. And the other kids might be like, we're too old for this. But no, this is just the way we do it in this house. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and I think that, I read a lot of things on social media where people with kids with autism talk about how people have made accommodations for their kids at birthday parties or events and created ways that they can be included. I think the thing with FASD is, if behaviours are sort of, undesirable, it's harder for those kids to be included. So we really need to be asking the parents, what's going to make this a success for your child? And what are the things that could go wrong? Like if a child's coming to a birthday party and they know there's going to be a lolly bag, they're not going to wait. They might need that lolly bag when they get there. But then what's going to happen is they're going to see everyone else going home with one and they're going to go, I want one now. And so I would put the lolly bag in half and I'll give them half at the start and half at the end, whatever that workaround might be. Because that child's not going to be able to wait till the end of the party for the lolly bag. They're going to fixate on it.
And it's all about, and it's actually, I think autism's a really great sort of connected to use here. It is thinking about the environment you're going into, how it's going to impact your little person or your big person, and then, deciding in advance what you need to do. And it takes extra planning, extra focus. It takes a lot of knowledge about your little person, but it means that everyone has a much better outcome when you do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so interesting.
I know, it's a great topic. And, I think
it's amazing in terms of the brain and the brain's impact and how it then, I feel like they are walking examples of our brains, the capacity of our brains and what happens when our brains are damaged, when our brains are impacted, because it does have such a diverse impact. There's a question I often get, and that is around how much alcohol is too much alcohol, or when is alcohol too much alcohol?
Yeah.
Is there science yet around that?
So the difficulty with the science is we haven't got controlled studies. So we have lots of studies, often where alcohol is self-reported. There is a study happening through the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. We're looking at longitudinal, and it's one where people reported during the pregnancy their alcohol intake. It's looking at low to moderate alcohol use. So there will be more data coming out there. I think in terms of what we do know is that, the heavier the alcohol use, the higher the risk. The heavier, the higher the alcohol use on a single occasion, the higher the risk. The longer during the pregnancy, the higher the risk. But having said that, there are things that make individuals particularly vulnerable, which include genetics. diet, age, etc., but also the timing. So there are windows of time, and this is the difficulty that, 1 or 2 binge episodes before a person knows they're pregnant could just do something at that really critical time when the brain is forming and interrupt a process that has a flow-on effect. And, there are a lot of people who've had a child diagnosed with FASD because there was a couple of episodes where they went to a cocktail party before they knew they were pregnant. And that's something that we need as a society to be saying this could happen to anybody, unless you are planning a pregnancy and being alcohol free before you're pregnant, which takes a lot of self-control to do that, a lot of planning. So yeah, and then I guess the other thing is, we have a threshold. Well, we don't have a threshold, but moderate to heavy alcohol use is more often associated with a FASD diagnosis. But we have a whole range of impairments that don't meet the threshold for an impairment, I guess. Just, a changes to the brain that might be very minor but might have an impact. And, in my generation, I think how many adults being diagnosed with ADHD, and we were many of us of parents where they consumed alcohol in pregnancy. So, I wonder about that.
Yeah, the difference, I suppose, between a clinical diagnosis level and something that still has happened and has an impact, it may not fit, it may not be severe enough to reach a FASD diagnosis, but it doesn't mean they're not additional barriers that child is dealing with. Yeah,
exactly.
Definitely.
And I think one of the big barriers, if I can just say this one thing, which I have been thinking, is that one of the biggest difficulties with children and young people in the community and in society is people look at them and say and think you've got an average IQ, therefore you should be able to do this. What we don't understand well is the difference between just cognitive ability and executive function ability. And I think we tend to see development of executive function skills as being almost like a positive personality trait. Like she's so organized, she gets up early and goes to the gym every morning. And she runs marathons, and that involves so much self-control that we really value that as a personality trait. So when people are seen as, don't have those skills, they get labelled sort of lazy, procrastinating, they're not just not doing the right thing, they're not meeting obligations. That we don't see that as a brain thing, we see it as a character thing because their IQ is normal. So I think what we have is we understand when people can't do things because of disability, intellectual disability, but everyone else should be able to do it. What we're not good at understanding is this is a group of kids and young people who can understand why they shouldn't do something, but they can't not do it.
Yep.
Our brains don't make sense of that very easily.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful point that, they might get the theory, but how they put that into practice is something completely different.
Yeah.
Oh, this has just been the most incredible conversation, Prue. I really hope that this has been as helpful for those listening as it has been for me. I've had a few little light bulb moments, and it just, every time I get to talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it helps me to understand my little guy that much more. And grow my empathy and compassion for those moments when he finds challenging, that I think, is so incredibly important. And when it does come to a diagnosis, I think that's the biggest thing you can do is actually understand where they're going to need that support, and then have compassion for that support so that you can help them through it in a way that is non-judgmental for them. So I'm really, really grateful for all of the insight and passion that you shared. 15 years working in FASD, there's a lot in that brain there. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, thanks, Carly. Look, great to talk to someone who is also so knowledgeable about this. And I think it's great what you're doing in terms of sharing stuff with parents and caregivers, because, many people aren't aware, as you say. So I think what you're doing is fabulous.
Oh, I really appreciate it, Prue. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Carly.